But Crockett, a former civil rights lawyer and public defender, stood unshaken, her steady gaze meeting his with quiet resolve. Those who knew her recognized the look. This wasn't just a debate, it was a reckoning. The man who had lectured America's greatest lawyers was about to face one of his most humbling moments. As CNN host Rebecca Mitchell opened the segment on the Voting Rights Protection Act, tension rippled through the studio. Neither Crockett nor Dershowitz broke eye contact, and viewers at home sensed this was more than a policy discussion. It was a clash between entrenched power and emerging conviction. Before diving into this electrifying exchange, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more in-depth political analysis. You won't want to miss how Jasmine Crockett turned the tables on one of America's most renowned legal voices. Rebecca welcomed the guest with a practiced smile. Tonight, we're joined by two legal experts to discuss the controversial Voting Rights Protection Act before Congress. Harvard Law Professor Emeritus Alan Dershowitz, who has represented some of America's most prominent clients, and Texas Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a rising star and co-sponsor of the bill. Dershowitz, immaculate in a Navy suit, sat upright, his silver hair catching the light. At 85, his legacy loomed large. He had taught generations of lawyers and defended clients like O.J. Simpson and Jeffrey Epstein. "Thank you, Rebecca," he began, his Boston accent cutting through the silence. "I've been teaching constitutional law since before the Congresswoman was born. Americans deserve to hear from someone who truly understands the Constitution." The condescension was unmistakable as he lifted his highlighted papers, a prop signaling his academic stature. Crockett, adjusting her gold necklace, leaned forward slightly. At 43, the Yale-educated attorney had built her career fighting for real people, families, workers, and voters, long before entering Congress. Her calm presence hinted at the courtroom discipline that had carried her through countless battles. "Good evening," she began, her voice smooth yet firm, carrying the warmth of her Texas roots. "Unlike some, I'm not here to lecture from an ivory tower. I'm here to discuss how this legislation protects the communities I've served in court and now in Congress." The host nodded, sensing the friction building. "Let's begin," she said. "Professor Dershowitz, you've called this bill unconstitutional. Congresswoman Crockett, you're a co-sponsor. What's at stake here?" Before Crockett could respond, Dershowitz jumped in. "What's at stake," he said sharply, "is the balance of power. The Constitution gives states, not Washington, authority over elections. Frankly, I'm surprised someone with a law degree supports this unconstitutional power grab." Crockett's lips curved into a faint smile, not of amusement, but of recognition. She had faced this tactic before, men with titles wielding arrogance as a weapon. Behind the scenes, her team had prepared meticulously, studying Dershowitz's speaking style, his tendency to interrupt, and his habit of dismissing opponents. What he didn't know was that Crockett had spent the weekend reviewing his own writings from the 1970s and 1980s, essays that contradicted his current stance, and had consulted 3 of his former students to pinpoint his debate weaknesses. In the control room, producers leaned forward, realizing this was no ordinary policy discussion. The Crockett-Dershowitz face-off was television gold, with social media teams already prepping clips for viral release. For Dershowitz, this was about preserving his reputation as America's top legal mind. For Crockett, it was about proving that a new generation, diverse, community-rooted, and fearless, deserved the stage. Rebecca turned to Crockett. "Congresswoman, your response to the professor's constitutional concerns?" Crockett straightened her notes, her tone sharpening. "I'll gladly respond, Rebecca, but let's start with something fundamental. Constitutional interpretation isn't just for Ivy League professors. It belongs to every American whose rights depend on it." Dershowitz raised an eyebrow, ready to interrupt, but Crockett pressed on. "The professor claims I misunderstand constitutional law. Let's look at the text. Article 1, Section 4 clearly gives Congress authority over federal elections. The 14th and 15th Amendments reinforce Congress's power to protect voting rights. That's not theory, it's written law." The studio fell silent. Crockett had turned what was meant to be a lecture into a masterclass of her own. Dershowitz shook his head, visibly irritated. "Congresswoman," he said with a thin smile, "I'm well aware of those clauses, but the Supreme Court has repeatedly upheld state control over elections. Shelby County versus Holder, for example." "I'm very familiar with Shelby County," Crockett interjected smoothly. "I've litigated voting rights cases affected by that ruling. The issue isn't whether states have authority, it's whether they're abusing it to silence voters." Dershowitz's expression tightened, That's emotional rhetoric, not legal reasoning, he snapped. The Constitution doesn't promise easy voting. It promises equal protection. Crockett didn't hesitate. When voting restrictions disproportionately target certain communities, that's not about convenience, it's constitutional harm. Rebecca, sensing the rising heat, steered the conversation. Let's discuss the bill's details. Professor, you've criticized the section mandating minimum early voting days. Why? Dershowitz leaned forward, energized. This is where Congress crosses the line, he said, tapping his papers. States have different populations, budgets, and needs. Imposing a one-size-fits-all rule ignores federalism. I have statements from election officials in 17 states warning of logistical chaos. He lifted a highlighted report for emphasis. Crockett listened calmly, then responded. Interesting, she said, pulling a folder. Because I have letters from 23 states, including many led by Republicans, supporting these standards as achievable and necessary. She turned to Dershowitz. But let's talk consistency. In your 1982 book, Rights of the People, you wrote, and I quote, "Federal voting standards may be essential when states discriminate or fail administratively." You endorsed national early voting standards. Has the Constitution changed, or just your opinion? The camera caught Dershowitz's brief flash of surprise. He fumbled with his papers. My thinking evolves with evidence, he replied. The voting landscape has shifted since the 1980s. Crockett nodded, her tone measured but cutting. So your constitutional interpretation shifts with political trends. That's quite a statement from a self-proclaimed originalist. The tension thickened. Rebecca intervened. Let's move to voter ID laws. Congresswoman, critics argue that limiting ID requirements weakens election integrity. Crockett replied, those critics ignore data. Studies like those from the Brennan Center show voter impersonation is virtually non-existent. What's real is that 25 million Americans lack the specific IDs some states demand. Dershowitz scoffed. The Brennan Center isn't unbiased, and claiming millions can't get IDs underestimates Americans' capability. It's insulting. Something flickered in Crockett's eyes. Anger, quickly controlled. Professor, she said calmly, have you represented someone who lost their vote because they couldn't afford ID paperwork? I have. Have you met elderly citizens without birth certificates from midwife births? I have. Have you spoken to workers who can't take unpaid hours to visit DMVs? I have. Calling these barriers insulting shows an ivory tower disconnect. Dershowitz leaned back, losing control of the conversation. Your anecdotes are moving, he said tersely, but they don't override the Constitution's state authority. Crockett countered. Let's talk Supreme Court. In Crawford v. Marion County, the court upheld Indiana's ID law, but noted it was based on limited evidence of voter burden. When evidence shows disenfranchisement, the balance shifts. She held up a document. And in your 2005 Harvard Law Review article, you criticized judges disguising policy preferences as constitutional rulings, specifically citing voter ID laws as potential political smokescreens. Dershowitz bristled. You're taking that out of context. Am I? Crockett shot back, raising an eyebrow. I have the full passage here. Would you like me to read it? Rebecca intervened, sensing a cliffhanger. We'll pause for a break. When we return, the debate continues with audience questions. During the break, Dershowitz whispered furiously to his aide, pointing at his notes. Something had gone wrong. Crockett, calm, sipped water. A producer asked if she needed anything. I'm fine, she said softly. But check on the professor. We haven't reached his most interesting contradictions yet. When the broadcast resumed, Dershowitz had regrouped, his jaw set. During the break, I reviewed my writings, not the Congresswoman's selective quotes, he said. My position is clear. Voting regulations must balance access and integrity. He looked at Crockett, determined to reclaim control. Dershowitz leaned back, irritation visible. Since the Congresswoman wants to compare credentials, he said, his tone dripping with superiority. I've argued over 50 cases before the Supreme Court and taught thousands of top attorneys. With respect, your brief time as a state legislator and first-term Congresswoman doesn't qualify you to lecture me on constitutional law. Crockett straightened, her expression unyielding. Professor, she began crisply, it's time to address the elephant in the room. You're leaning on your resume instead of my arguments. That might work in a classroom, but this isn't Harvard Law and I'm not your student. A murmur rippled through the audience. Dershowitz's face stiffened. I'm addressing substance, he said defensively. You're fixated on old quotes. I'm highlighting your evolving opinions, Crockett countered. You've argued states should have broad discretion over election laws. Yet in December 2020, you claimed state legislatures weren't bound by their own constitutions when appointing presidential electors, a stance that could have voided millions of votes. She lifted a document. Your own words, Professor. Dershowitz shifted, uneasy. That was a specific argument about the electors clause, not general voting regulations. Is it? Crockett pressed. Both involve federalism and the right to vote. Your positions seem to shift with political outcomes, the audience murmured. Dershowitz's face flushed. That's outrageous, he snapped. My positions are guided by rigorous reasoning, not politics. Crockett nodded calmly. Then let's examine that reasoning. You cite Shelby County to justify reducing federal oversight, but even Chief Justice Roberts affirmed Congress's authority to address voting discrimination, authority this bill exercises. I've represented voters impacted by Shelby County's fallout. Closed polling places, voter purges, ID laws targeting minorities with surgical precision. Dershowitz tried to interrupt, but Crockett raised her hand. I listened to you without interruption, she said firmly. He hesitated, then stayed silent. You mentioned your Supreme Court experience, she continued. I respect that, but I've fought for real people in state courts, elderly voters, working families, where constitutional theory meets reality. This bill doesn't federalize elections. It sets minimum standards to prevent suppression while preserving state flexibility. Rebecca turned to Dershowitz. Professor, your response? He cleared his throat. The Congresswoman's experiences are touching, but personal stories don't override the Constitution. Section 306's 42 federal mandates for early voting and polling locations aren't minimum standards. They're overreach. Crockett smiled slightly. I'm glad you mentioned Section 306, Professor, because it was modeled after legislation you endorsed in your 1991 congressional testimony. You called similar provisions appropriately tailored federal safeguards that respect state authority while ensuring ballot access. She held up a transcript. This is from your testimony, March 14, 1991. Shall I read your full statement? Dershowitz blinked rapidly, rattled. I'd need to verify that, he muttered. Of course, Crockett replied, sliding the paper across. Take your time. The camera zoomed in on Dershowitz's face, confidence melting into confusion. The text matched her quote exactly. Crockett turned to the audience. This highlights a deeper issue. Voting rights are often treated as abstract theories, not protections for real Americans. The same authorities who once defended federal voting protections now oppose them, not because the Constitution changed, but because politics did. Dershowitz, scrambling, said, Even if I supported similar provisions then, Supreme Court rulings have evolved. Which rulings? Crockett asked politely. In Shelby County, the court required Congress to modernize pre-clearance formulas. Our bill does that, using current data on discriminatory practices. She turned to Rebecca. This isn't abstract. It's about whether every American, regardless of zip code, work hours, or ability, has equal ballot access. The Constitution affirms Congress's duty to act when that access is threatened. The studio fell silent as Crockett dismantled Dershowitz's arguments with precision, citing case law and bill sections flawlessly. In a final attempt to regain control, Dershowitz said, Congresswoman, you don't fully understand this bill's unintended consequences. Section 502 could harm minority voters by diluting their representation. Crockett's smile widened. Professor, there's a small problem. There is no Section 502 in this bill. It has 428 sections. The audience gasped. Dershowitz froze, flipping through his papers, realizing he'd confused this bill with another. I meant Section 402, he stammered. Section 402 addresses ballot drop boxes, not vote dilution, Crockett corrected. Perhaps you're thinking of H.R. 2722 from last Congress. The studio went silent. A devastating moment for Dershowitz. Rebecca turned to him. Professor, would you like to reconsider your position? Dershowitz hesitated, his confidence cracked. I maintain constitutional concerns, but some criticisms may have been based on outdated information. I'll need to review the bill further. Crockett nodded respectfully. I appreciate that, Professor. I'd be happy to send your office a breakdown of how each section aligns with precedent. Perhaps we can find common ground in protecting every American's vote. Her graciousness deepened the contrast between them. As the segment wrapped, viewers knew they'd witnessed something extraordinary, a generational shift in legal discourse. Clips of Crockett exposing Dershowitz's error went viral, with Dr. Crockett Clapback trending nationwide. Conservative analyst Andrew McCarthy tweeted, Crockett delivered a masterclass in preparation. Dershowitz brought generalities. She brought receipts. On MSNBC, Rachel Maddow said, this was David versus Goliath, not with a slingshot but with surgical precision. CNN producers, expecting a dry debate, raced to extend coverage, releasing a primetime special, The New Defenders, Rising Voices in Legal Debate, featuring Crockett. In his Manhattan apartment, Dershowitz faced a humbling night, his phone buzzing with messages from colleagues and students. Harvard law forums lit up, noting how Crockett turned the Socratic method against him. By morning, he issued a statement. While I maintain reservations about federal election laws, Congresswoman Crockett's command of the material was impressive. Her respectful debate merits acknowledgement. For Crockett, the aftermath was transformative. Her office overflowed with interview requests, her social media following tripled, and House Democratic leaders tapped her to lead a voting rights press conference. 3 representatives who had hesitated on the bill pledged their votes, giving it new momentum. Legal scholars dissected the debate. A Yale professor wrote, Crockett showed that lived experience and legal expertise create a deeper constitutional interpretation than theory alone. Georgetown Law announced a forum, Credentials versus Substance, inspired by the exchange. Civil rights groups like the NAACP praised Crockett's arguments as reinforcing federal voting protections. Voting rights advocates in Georgia, North Carolina, and Arizona reported spikes in volunteer signups, citing Crockett's defense. Conservative media like Fox News tried to reframe the story, but even analysts admitted Dershowitz was outmatched. He leaned on reputation. She leaned on preparation, said former Judge Andrew Napolitano. 3 days later, Dershowitz requested a private meeting with Crockett at her Capitol Hill office. Alone, he said, Congresswoman, I've reviewed the bill. While I have concerns, your constitutional analysis was sound. Your point about law needing lived reality was well taken. Crockett suggested a joint op-ed, Finding Constitutional Common Ground on Voting Rights, which they published in the Washington Post. The piece went viral, showing intellectual cooperation over confrontation. It concluded, when debate centers on substance over status, democracy grows stronger. Crockett received invitations to speak at Harvard, Yale, and Howard. Law schools reported surging enrollment in voting rights courses. Young attorneys and women of color wrote to thank her. You showed us we don't need to shrink ourselves to face power, wrote a Michigan law student. At a Congressional Black Caucus meeting, civil rights icon James Clyburn told her, you didn't just win a debate, you changed the conversation for good. 6 weeks later, a revised Voting Rights Protection Act passed the House with bipartisan support. Its Senate future was uncertain, but analysts credited Crockett's performance for shifting public understanding of voting rights' constitutional and human stakes. The exchange became a landmark case study in communications and law schools, showing how authority is shifting. Titles still mattered, but knowledge, preparation, and authenticity now defined influence. For millions, the confrontation transcended partisanship. It was about who shapes democracy's conversation. Reflecting with her staff, Crockett said, this was never about embarrassing Dershowitz. It was about ensuring every citizen's vote is protected in practice, not just theory. When legal theory meets lived reality, that's where justice begins. The Crockett-Dershowitz clash reminded America that in a healthy democracy, ideas win on merit, not credentials. It proved the power of preparation, moral clarity, and fearlessness in facing authority. Amid distrust in institutions and debates over election integrity, Crockett's performance underscored the need for leaders who bridge abstract law with real-world impact, ensuring democracy remains inclusive. Law professors now teach the exchange alongside landmark debates, with textbooks including excerpts of Crockett's arguments. Her approach, combining rigorous legal analysis with lived experience, has inspired a new generation of advocates to prioritize substance over status. For the millions of voters whose access hangs in the balance, Crockett's stand was a reminder that one voice, armed with facts and conviction, can shift history. Her performance galvanized grassroots efforts, with voter registration drives citing her as inspiration for record turnout in key states. As the national voting rights debate continues, Crockett's clarity and courage remain a beacon, proving that the most effective response to arrogance is being better prepared and unafraid to stand your ground. If this deep dive into the Crockett-Dershowitz showdown inspired you, like this video, subscribe and tap the bell icon for more breakdowns of political moments shaping America's future. Share this story with anyone who believes preparation and principle can redefine power. Stay tuned as we bring you more stories of rising voices transforming truth, leadership, and democracy. From courtrooms to Congress, these moments remind us that the fight for justice is won, not by the loudest voice, but by the most prepared and principled.